the door. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Reverend Rebecca Bryan. I'm the minister here of the First Religious Society, Unitarian Universalist, in beautiful Newburyport on a beautiful spring day. Thank you so much for coming out and for welcoming our guests, Amy and Scott Weidensaul. It's been a delightful morning with them already, and you're in for some inspirational, informational, and inspiring things that you're going to be hearing. So we're so delighted to have all of you, and also, of course, to have you both here with us today. I wanted to also thank our Green Team members. There are many, so I won't go into particular names, but a couple are standing right behind me, Annie and Bill and others, Lance and Sandra and Lucy, and there's a whole team of people here committed to environmental justice, and I know that they would welcome any of you to join them anytime. It is not solely a church team or committee at all. It's about our commitment, which is one of our Unitarian Universalist values, to environmental justice, to climate change, and to what it is that we are going to do to respond to all that is happening today. So a couple of quick logistics. There are restrooms in our lower level, and you can go down the stairs to the right out the doors. We also have a lift, if that's more convenient or your preference, that any of our members or ushers in the rear could help you use. And there is a reception after the presentation that everyone is invited to attend and to chat and to talk amongst each other and to enjoy some fellowship and food, also through those stairs or the lift that will get you downstairs. So thank you again for being here, and I look forward to hearing and learning. I'll turn it over now to Annie Madden.
Thank you, Reverend Rebecca. I have 3 brief items to share before the Weidensauls take the podium, and then we'll get right to them. A bit of context, some thanks, and then a short bit about Scott and Amy. The FRS Green Team envisioned this event as an assembly of local and regional folks who love birds, nature, healthy ecosystems, and who are committed to the work of caring for all creatures and for the habitats that sustain them. And as we know, we are gathering at a time when the federal government is retreating from supporting the agencies and eliminating funds that allow for the work that needs to be done to preserve those habitats and a stable climate. Today we bring together many local and regional organizations, groups, advocates, and activists to continue that important work with even more vigor. Thank you all for being here. Many have helped to organize this event, thanks to all on the Green Team, the FRS staff, and for the work behind the scenes to make this happen, this community-wide event. And to Lance for his inspiration to make this community-wide event happen. Thanks to Carol Decker, previous director of the Massachusetts Mass Audubon's Ipswich River Wildlife Sanctuary, and to Nancy Powell, senior biologist at the Parker River National Wildlife Refuge at Plum Island, for connecting us with the Weidensauls, who they have known closely through their work and deep commitment to caring for birds and the environment. Lastly, we want to acknowledge all of you in the audience who are part of the work that is ahead. If you consider yourself a climate activist, an environmentalist, a land steward, a gardener, a birder, a farmer, or simply a lover of nature and the outdoors, please rise now so we can acknowledge you. Thank you all for being here. And now, on to the Weidensauls. Scott is an author of nearly 30 books on natural history, including the Pulitzer Prize finalist Living on the Wind, and his latest New York Times bestseller, A World on the Wing. Dr. Amy Weidensaul is Mass Audubon's Senior Director for Sanctuaries and an ecologist and an educator. Amy's North Shore work has included the Joppa Flats Education Center and Ipswich River Wildlife Sanctuary. They have dedicated their lives to birds, whether it involves extensive travels to know these creatures, sharing their knowledge through writing, or working with the public to share the excitement of being out of doors with birds and nature. Their lives, no surprise, came together due to their love of birds as well. As Amy shares, birds brought them together. They met at Hog Island Audubon Camp in Maine. Amy was there as a staff member of the National Audubon, and Scott was one of the instructors of field ornithology. And some of their first dates involved hawk and hummingbird banding. And some of their, they were also married on Hog Island. Birds, of course, are a big part of their lives, professionally and personally. They have a unique perspective to share about how birds can connect us to wonder and nature, and to the work we must all do to ensure that we protect birds, healthy ecosystems, and nature itself for the future of all. We are truly honored to have them here with us today. Welcome, Scott and Amy.
Well, thank you very much. I have to say, when we were dating, a good friend said, "Scott Weidensaul, you are using birds to further your romantic life." And I said, "Yes." Your point? It's wonderful. It was wonderful to see everybody rise to their feet. This is sort of the definition of preaching to the choir, but this is a time when all of us in the choir need to feel that we're all pulling in the same direction against some pretty hard headwinds right now. We need as much help as we can get, and birds can get us there. Right now, all across the world, all across the northern hemisphere, we have birds coming back to their breeding grounds. I don't know about you, it seemed like an awfully long, cold, snowy winter to me, but I knew that at the other end of it, these gorgeous birds were going to come flooding back into New England, flooding back into our backyards, flooding into the woods around our homes, filling the world with life and color and sound and beauty, and getting on with the important things in life, because for them, there is nothing else more important than reproduction, passing on genes to the next generation, unaware of the chaos around them, unaware of the chaos that's touching their very lives. You know, we're at a point that, quite frankly, I never thought I would see in my life. I had seen this long procession. I had people holding up the ears. Sorry, I'll speak a little bit more loudly. Is that better? Okay, thank you. Say amen, brother. Amen. All right, there we go. I never thought I would get to this point in my life where I would see the kind of retreat that we have seen in the last 100 days from the bedrock of science and environmental protection, that I would see us turn our backs on the natural systems that make life on this planet possible, that I would never see the hollowing out of federal resource agencies. This is a time when each and every one of us needs to be an activist on behalf of birds and on behalf of ourselves, because a world that works for birds works for us. This is a time when nature and conservation need every friend they can get. They need every supportive voice they can find. They need the people who don't know how much they enjoy nature because they haven't been introduced to it yet. And one of the best ways to introduce people to nature is through birds. Because birds do incredible things. Birds are incredible creatures. Birds are everywhere and all at once. And, you know, we saw this during the pandemic, when during those isolating months, initial months in the lockdown, which happened to coincide with spring migration, where people were trying to wrestle with this newly quiet, newly insular world, and they realized that right outside their window, there were these global migrations, Birds coming from the forests of Mesoamerica, birds passing from the farthest reaches of South America on their way to the Arctic tundra, passing right through their backyards, right over their heads. And the result, not surprisingly, is a lot of people got hooked on birds. We've seen an incredible growth in birding in the last, 15 years or so. Between 2006 and 2022, we went from about 48 million people in America that can consider themselves birders, who make an effort to identify birds. Just not that they just hung a feeder in the backyard or they notice birds while they're mowing their grass, but people who make an effort to understand birds. Went from 48 million to 96 million people, according to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That's 37% of all adult Americans are to some degree birders. And that's an entry point for those people, even the new ones, into conservation, to becoming conservation activists and being those voices for conservation and science and environmental protection that we need right now. And when those people spend any amount of time learning about birds, more often than not, they get hooked. And why not? Because birds do astounding things. For example, this is a semi-palmated sandpiper, one of the most common shorebirds along the coast of Massachusetts. They're migrating north right now, heading up to the Arctic to breed. And they'll spend the summer breeding up in the Canadian Arctic, the eastern and central Canadian Arctic. And this is a small bird. They're like 6 inches long, 0.8 of an ounce. In the fall, when those birds start coming south again, they will make an extraordinary migration. They will take off from the northeastern coast of North America and fly 3,300 miles nonstop across the western Atlantic to their wintering grounds on the northeastern coast of South America. That's a 4 or 5 day flight with no food, no water, and no rest. They are extraordinary athletes. In fact, don't get me going on comparing human athletes to bird athletes, because there is absolutely no comparison. One could argue that the most elite human athletes are Tour de France cyclists at peak condition. They're operating at about 3 or 4 times their base metabolic rate, which is impressive, but they're only doing that with regular food and regular hydration, and they can only do that for a limited amount of time, certainly less than a day. That little semi-palm sandpiper, that little whiff of feathers, is operating at 9 or 10 times its base metabolic rate, which is already high. It's about 104-degree body temperature, and doing this, as I said, for 4 or 5 days, where if they stop beating their wings for even a few minutes, they're in the water and they're dead. So that is a human athlete. But there is one way in which some of these semi-palmated sandpipers have something in common with at least some human athletes. So in the fall, as these birds are heading out of the Canadian Arctic, they stage up in late August and early September, many of them along the Bay of Fundy, between Maine and Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. And of course, the tides in the Bay of Fundy rise and fall like as much as 40 feet. And when they fall, they expose these enormous areas of mud. And in that mud are trillions and trillions of tiny little crustaceans called coroffium. And the semi-palm sandpipers seek out and preferentially feed on the coroffium. I have never eaten coroffium. Maybe they taste really good. I'm not really quite sure. But we do know that the coroffium are really high in omega-3 fatty acids. And those omega-3 fatty acids supercharge the aerobic capacity of the bird's flight muscles. They are juicing on performance-enhancing drugs and doing it legally. And if you think that's impressive, let me introduce you to the bar-tailed godwit. This is a shorebird that breeds across Eurasia, but there's a population that breeds in western and northern Alaska. They're the size of a large pigeon, small duck, long skinny bill, long skinny legs, and they undergo the longest nonstop migration of any land bird in the world. Every year, they leave Alaska and they fly 8,100 miles nonstop across the widest part of the Pacific Ocean to their wintering grounds in New Zealand and the coast of Australia. And before they do that, they undergo something called hyperphagia, which is basically binge feeding. You've seen hyperphagia at work at your last family reunion when Uncle Fred went through the buffet line. They just eat and eat and eat and eat and eat until they balloon up. They're 55% fat by the time they're ready to fly. They're the heaviest, fattest wild birds anybody's ever documented. And having gotten to that point, they no longer need their digestive system, so they get rid of it. In a matter of days, their stomach, their intestines, to a lesser extent their kidneys and their liver shrink down and atrophy dramatically at the same time that their chest muscles, their pectoral muscles that power flight, increase by 50%, and their heart muscle mass increases by 30 to 50%. They get ripped and buff without exercise. I would like very much to be able to do that. And then they take off. They make this extraordinary journey. They fly all the way across the Pacific. They do not stop along the way. There are essentially no records of these birds anywhere in the islands of the South Pacific. They land in New Zealand, regrow their guts, spend the austral summer feeding, and then come March and April, the whole process starts again. Balloon up in weight, guts shrink down, they take off. Now, they can't go back the way they came because what helped them across the Pacific were powerful tailwinds, and they'd be fighting those tailwinds. So they go the other way. They fly about 6,000 miles nonstop from Australia and New Zealand to the Yellow Sea between China and the Korean Peninsula. Land, regrow their guts, eat, balloon up in weight, guts shrink down, fly another 4,500 miles from there back up to their breeding grounds in the Arctic. This is a bird that will fly a total of about 18,000 miles a year, averaging about, it's in the air for about 22 days, and it's going to average about 820 miles a day. This is a species that can live 25 or 30 years, so that by the time one of these godwits dies, it has flown the distance from here to the moon and most of the way back again. Birds are incredible, and we're still finding out how incredible birds are. I'm a college dropout. Don't hold it against me. But before I dropped out of college, I took a wonderful course in ornithology back in the late 1970s. And at the time, we were starting to crack the code of how birds are able to navigate and orient. That's one of the most mysterious aspects of bird migration. We've known since the 1960s that one of the most important cues for migratory birds, and most birds migrate at night, even the ones that are normally active in the daytime, one of the most important cues for them is the night sky. Now, not the pattern of the stars in the sky. They're not looking up and saying, the giant W is Cassiopeia, so that means I make a left. They are aware in real time of the rotation, the apparent rotation of the stars in the night sky around Polaris. I defy you to see that yourself in real time, but the birds can sense that. So that gives them their compass points, north, south, east, west, with an obvious drawback, because some nights it's cloudy. But birds have a whole series of fallbacks that they can use. Seabirds like albatrosses and storm petrels and shearwaters have an extraordinarily keen sense of smell. They can smell their way back home across thousands of miles of ocean. Little leeches, storm petrels that breed by the millions on Baccalieu Island off the coast of Newfoundland will find their burrow among 4 million other burrows in the dark by how it smells. Diurnal raptors, or diurnal migrants like raptors and swallows, they use the position and movement of the sun across the sky. They use leading lines on the landscape like mountain ridges and coastlines and river valleys. But the most mysterious of all of a bird's migration cues has always been its magnetic sense. We've known since the late 19th century that birds, like many organisms, can sense the Earth's impossibly weak magnetic field. The refrigerator magnet you have is hundreds of times more powerful than the Earth's magnetic field. And yet we know that newts and bumblebees and bacteria and birds can sense it, but we've never been able to figure out how. And it turns out that the way that birds at least are able to sense the Earth's magnetic field is so weird that even though it's an aspect of quantum mechanics, that even though it grew out of Einstein's own equations, he more or less disowned it. It's called quantum entanglement. And I am not a quantum physicist, but I'm going to try to explain to you my understanding of what's happening. So let's say that you're a summer tanager like this one. You've just taken off from the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, heading north on your migration across the Gulf of Mexico. And as you're flying through the night sky, a photon of light that was emitted 100 million years ago from a distant star enters your eye, strikes your retina, and it hits something called cryptochrome. Cryptochrome is a protein pigment. It's a pigment protein. And the eyes of migratory birds are packed with cryptochrome. And the cryptochrome the photon hits the cryptochrome. It knocks a molecule off. God, let me back up. My tongue is getting ahead of my brain here, which happens when I get excited. It knocks an electron off a molecule onto an adjacent molecule. Yep, okay, got that right. So you now have unequal numbers of electrons on these two molecules. They are now quantumly entangled. They're what's called a radical pair. Under quantum theory, if you were to move those two molecules anywhere in the universe, what affects one would instantaneously affect the other. Don't expect me to explain this to you. I'm just telling you what the experts are telling me. That supposedly is going to give us unhackable quantum computers and faster than light communication. But what it also does, for the briefest fraction of a second, is it magnetizes that cryptochrome protein. You now have a magnetically sensitive pigment in the eyes of migratory birds. They can see the Earth's magnetic field. Do you know what I would give to see the Earth's magnetic field? My mental image of it is like the aurora borealis on steroids. We have no idea what it looks like. We can't ask the birds. It's probably just a smudge in their eye, but it tells them whether they are going north, away from the pole as they're flying through these waves of the Earth's geomagnetic field, or if it's going from the poles down toward the equator. So that gives them their north-south orientation. Now, there's an east-west magnetic compass that they have that we haven't quite figured out yet. Every time we think we figured out everything there is about birds, we find something new. Every time we think we understand what the limits of bird migration are, the birds blow right past them. This is not a bird you're going to see in Newburyport. This is an alpine swift, a common breeding species in Central and Western Europe. And about 10, 12 years ago, scientists in Switzerland were curious about where the nesting alpine swifts in their community went. So they captured a bunch of these birds harmlessly. They fitted them with basically little fanny packs that had data. It was a data logger. So there was a gizmo in there called a geolocator that would record roughly where the bird was every day on its migration south into Africa and all the way back the next year back to Switzerland, where they would be able to catch it and retrieve the data. And there was also a tiny little accelerometer in there that would allow them to tell how much of the bird's day was spent in flight, how much of the bird's day was spent at rest. They had that information for the breeding grounds. They wanted to get that for the wintering grounds. So they send these birds off on their way. They had to wait till the next year for the birds to come back. They recaptured a bunch of them. They downloaded the data, and they said, oh, look at that. The birds are flying across the Sahara Desert and the Mediterranean Sea down into the bulge of tropical West Africa. They came back across, many of them across the Straits of Gibraltar in the springtime. Oh, that's fun. Let's look at the accelerometer data. And that's when their jaw hit the ground. Because according to the accelerometer data, these birds never stopped flying for 7.5 months. From the whole time from their departure in Switzerland all the way down to their wintering grounds in Africa, throughout the winter in Africa and all the way back, they never landed. Now, swifts are the most aerial of all birds. They eat nothing but flying insects. They're the only group of birds that mate on the wing, but come on, 7.5 months? And yet 2 years later, when scientists in Sweden replicated that experiment with common swifts, they found out that they spend 10 months of the year in constant flight. We thought, okay, maybe this is just something that old world swifts do. Actually, black swifts from Western North America, which winter in South America, do exactly the same thing. And in all likelihood, all of the world's swifts only come to land when they absolutely have to. If they figure out how to incubate an egg on the wing, we'll never see them again. And if 10 months is impressive, consider the sooty tern. This is a beautiful seabird that nests in the Caribbean and the tropical Pacific. And when a young sooty tern leaves its nesting island for the first time, it doesn't return to land again until it's fully mature at age 4.5 or 5. And terns, although they are seabirds, cannot rest for long periods in the water. They're not that waterproof. So for 4.5 or 5 years, sooty terns simply fly. Now, how do you sleep if you're flying for 4.5 years? Well, you do something called unihemispheric sleep, which is that you just put half of your brain to sleep at a time, and then you just lob consciousness back and forth from one side to the other. And you can just do that endlessly. If I'm not paying attention, and Amy says something to me, and I go, and she catches me on it, I simply say, well, sweetheart, I was unihemispherically sleeping. And it never works. I got hooked on birds early. I basically came out of the womb interested in nature. I was more serious about reptiles and amphibians when I was a kid, but I came around to birds in high school and college. And I got particularly hooked on birds at a place called Hawk Mountain Sanctuary in eastern Pennsylvania, the world's first sanctuary for birds of prey, founded in 1934. Every year, about 20,000 hawks, eagles, falcons, and vultures passes North Lookout at Hawk Mountain. I went there for the first time when I was 12, and it blew my mind. I can point to that one day and say that day changed my life. Birds that day changed my life. I got hooked on raptors because raptors are the coolest of all birds, as all right-thinking people know. I got hooked on the Appalachian Mountains, among which I had grown up and along which these birds were flying. And Appalachian ecology has been a passion of mine ever since. But most of all, that day, I got hooked on migration. The notion that you had birds, peregrine falcons born in Greenland on their way to southern South America, broad-winged hawks from the forests of Quebec, passing literally over my house on their way to the forests of Bolivia. This hemispheric river passing right through my life. Birds can do that to people. And migration, I got hooked on migration that day, and it's been more than 50 years, and it hasn't taken its hooks out of me ever since. It's been really the defining passion of my personal and professional lives. Birds need all the friends they can get right now, and the environment does, and birds are one of the best ways to bring people to that. And so for those of you who stood up earlier because you were a birder, your charge today is to go out and find somebody who isn't and introduce them to birds. But there are lots of ways to do that, and I'm going to pass the mic over to Amy, who's been doing this professionally for a really, really long time, and let her take it from here.
Thanks, Scott. Just needed to get this down a little bit lower for me. He's a hard act to follow, so everyone just nod along when I talk. All right. So I, too, was kind of born a complete bird nerd. I had the incredible fortune of growing up in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and I spent my days after school and my weekends running around the pitch pine forest, those coastal pine barrens that we have on the South Shore. I spent my summers playing on the mud flats and the salt marshes and the Upper Cape, and I put rope on docks and tried to see what would grow on the lines and pull those up in the summer months. So I was incredibly fortunate, and I had parents and a family that supported me through all of that. I'd come home with hunks of pine sap in my hair, and my mother would cut it out and try to make me look okay, and all of that was incredibly supported. I was always a science kid. I loved science. I loved learning. And so, my career path, I wasn't really exposed to a whole lot of environmental career options. So, I figured, okay, I'm going to go in and I'm going to study science. And so my options are kind of, I can be a doctor because I'm mission-based and I want to give back, or I could be a veterinarian because I love animals. So I went to the University of New Hampshire and went in as a biology major. And my sophomore year, I took an ecology course, and that was a game changer. I loved the interconnectedness. I loved the ecosystems. I loved all of it. And so from that moment on, I decided, okay, I'm going to be a field biologist. I'm going to get out in the field. I'm going to, observe and record and document wildlife. And then I took my first job with Mass Audubon, which was in 1996, 97, somewhere around there. And I took a job as a piping plover monitoring technician. I'm not sure that was the title back then, on Plymouth Beach. So this is the town that I grew up in. This is the beach that I mostly spent my winters and off-season exploring. We weren't a huge beach family, but so I decided, okay, I can do this job. I can walk the beach and I can record the birds, and this is gonna be amazing. And it was really hard, really, really, really hard, because in 1996, the piping plover had been on the Endangered Species Act had been listed for less than 10 years. So this was an incredibly controversial time for plovers. This is when, towns were starting to take action around restrictions that could happen on beaches. And people weren't happy about it, and people still aren't happy about it. And I know that. And I know I'm in a town that has a coastal community where we do a lot of piping plover monitoring. But this summer was transformative for me, not only because I had an amazing opportunity to walk the beaches early in the morning and see, some of the first pairs of black skimmers breeding in that part of New England. It was amazing. I had least terns that I got to band. I watched piping plovers. But it was transformative not only because of those natural history experiences, but it was transformative because I saw the power of people, both in a good and in a bad way. Right? I walked that beach wearing proudly in the beginning my Mass Audubon uniform. People yelled at me, people threw cans at me. I saw more cars with bumper stickers that said piping plovers taste like chicken than I did without. Cars on the beach without bumper stickers. So that moment, I had thought, okay, I'm on this career path to, monitor and do field biology. And at that summer, I realized I could spend every waking hour out on that beach, putting up symbolic fencing and counting the birds and tracking them and understanding how many babies fledged. But if we didn't engage people in defining the solutions and implementing those solutions, we won't have any piping plovers. So from that moment on, I chose a career path and a personal path that involved the human dimension of conservation work. So this is a term that's gotten more popularity in the last 10 years or so, 10, 15 years. This is really the social science of on-the-ground conservation work. And for folks who have had a career or currently have a career in wildlife management, you know what I'm talking about. It's about applying the social science. How do we move people to change their behaviors to benefit or to better manage a suite of species or a landscape or an ecosystem? So that human dimension is incredibly important. And it makes sense, right? As E.O. Wilson coined the term biophilia, it's that natural, innate, deep connection that we all have to nature. Obviously, all of us in this room wouldn't give up a Sunday afternoon to come listen to two people talk about birds if they didn't already know that deep connection. But everyone has that deep connection. It's about opening up the hearts, minds, and eyes to that connection. Understanding there is a connection, right? Spending time outside brings an incredible amount of joy, reduction in stress, reduction in anxiety. We saw this so much during the pandemic, right? People were craving green space, no matter what it was, a small little bit of green space in an urban landscape, a big backyard, a wild place. People needed that green space. They needed that connection to nature and to be able to experience it. And that happens every day. We just felt it on steroids during the pandemic because we had so much anxiety, so many unknowns, so much stress, and so much isolation. And people were seeking those experiences outside to lessen all of that. And there's studies upon studies, research studies and research studies that show the power and importance of nature to our well-being, to our mental and physical health. And we all know that. And birds are an incredible way to tap into that. It's an incredible way to get people to connect to nature. So as Scott had mentioned, bird watching has grown in popularity over the last decades. The pandemic, we saw this big spike. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Survey estimate is 3 out of 10 people engage in bird watching. So engage in bird watching, not just, they self-identify as watching birds in their free time. There's incredible power, and many of you, I'm sure, are bird watchers. And why we do it for a whole variety of reasons, right? There's that social connection. You go on a bird walk with someone else, you go with a group. There's that incredible power of that social connection, but there's also the sharing that you do in a group chat or eBird where you say, oh, I saw this bird here. There's all that social dynamic that's incredibly important and why birding is so impactful. And also, they're just amazing, as Scott just shared only a few examples of how are we not wowed by them every day. And every species is mind-blowing. So how do we take that power to mobilize and inspire people to take action? Because birds are unreal. And so I have, I've been sort of professionally and in my free time an environmental educator for most of my career. And I always say that birds are the best tool to have in your toolkit if you're an educator, if you're an environmental or nature-based educator, because they're everywhere. You can go to the most human-developed landscape and find birds. You can talk, I could talk for, both of us, sadly, could talk for a long time about how amazing pigeons are. So you can kind of choose any species and spend a tremendous amount of time talking about them. They're extremely accessible. You don't even have to get out of your pajamas if you chose to. You can sit in your living room, you can sit at your kitchen table. If you're fortunate enough to have a front or a backyard, you can look at those birds at your feeder, never even leave your comforts of your house or leave your sweatpants, take your sweatpants off. So birds are incredibly accessible. You also can go to the most remote and wild places and have those exotic experiences and be wowed by birds. And they're fascinating. They're in everything. We see them everywhere, right? If you just take a moment and think about how you've experienced birds outside of going and watching them out your window, right? Birds are incorporated into everything we do. And there's mainstream, TV show on Netflix that features birders. So birds are incorporated into the arts, into the music, into literature. They're everywhere. And they also have such a strong sense of place, or they give us such a strong sense of place. You speak to older generations and they can talk about and share memories of birds when they were a child. They can remember hearing bluebirds. They may not know what a bluebird is, which is absolutely fine. They may not be able to name it, but they can tell you what that song was, or where they saw it, or what it looked like. People have this innate curiosity and love for birds. That's why things like those Bird Buddy cameras and the bird nest cameras are so popular. I have friends who text me pictures like this and say, "What is this? What's it doing? It's just looking at the camera. Why does it keep tilting its head?" And so people, even though that friend had no idea what this was, but she wanted to know. Not that she wanted to name it, but she wanted to know, what is this bird doing, right? So if we put our phones down and you look out there, this is what grabs at the hearts and imagination, right? Is because people are like, what is that thing doing? That thing's in my backyard, that thing's down the street, that thing's in my schoolyard or in my community. Yeah, that's why. It grabs that curiosity, which we all have deep down inside of us. So birds are also indicators of overall what's happening, right? So our populations, as Scott had kind of mentioned, right, bird populations, are declining. Some of the worst are around shorebirds, or for shorebirds and grassland birds. So they're telling us something, right? Those species are declining because their overall quality of their health is being impacted. That habitat, that ecosystem. So they create opportunities for us to talk about what's going on in our world, or in our community, or in our state, or in our country, right? They're indicators of what's more than just happening to these particular individual or species themselves. But they also give us a tremendous amount of hope and inspiration. These birds have amazing stories of success. They're incredibly resilient and adaptable. So we have to grab on to that hope and hold that inspiration and use birds to inspire others, inspire ourselves, because as we've talked about this afternoon, it's a challenging time, and we need to grab hold of that inspiration and let it lift us up. Take that time to be wowed by the kestrel and share that with someone else. And take that inspiration and pivot it towards action. Be wowed by those birds. So much of these action steps are probably things many of you are already doing. And so just take them as a moment of thinking about how you can share these with others, if these are things you're already doing in your own space and place. you know, we're really fortunate here in Essex County, and I think I see several familiar faces from other organizations, right? Essex County has an incredible amount of environmental nonprofits. We have an incredible amount of protected land here. That's something we should be super proud of. And we also, you know, I'm sure many of you are already involved in organizations like Greenbelt, the trustees, Mass Audubon. We have, you know, state parks. We have the Parker River National Wildlife Refuge. We have smaller land trusts like BTA Bolt and Boxford. There's an amazing amount of environmental and green groups, Ipswich River Watershed, and I'm gonna get in this bad cycle of trying to list them all, which is not good. So I'm sorry, because I only listed a few right there, but gives you an idea, right? And you all know this, there's tons of environmental organizations, and there's lots of opportunities for engagement. There's lots of opportunities for all of us to be involved in many different ways. I don't mean just financially, of course, financially is wonderful, but there are other ways to be involved and take action and help all these incredibly important green spaces. There's also actions that you can take in your community, like inspiring native plant gardens that are really beneficial for birds and even more so for insects, which in many regards becomes food for baby birds, which is really good. So, you know, planting native in your own front yard, backyard, side yard, or getting involved in a community garden to be able to incorporate native plants into those landscapes and those places. Make your place more bird friendly. There's lots of ways that we can reduce bird collision into windows. There are decals, there's stickers, there's plantings. There's lots of ways that you can reduce that. During that spring and fall migration, the bird collision is a big thing for birds. So trying to dramatically reduce that possibility of happening is really important. Planting natives in your yard is really important. Keeping your cat indoors so that birds don't have to struggle with having to be gobbled up by your cat. All of those are great ways to help give back to the environment and to birds more specifically. But really what I task you with, and Scott mentioned this as well, is introduce someone else to the power of nature, to the power of birds. Take them on a nature-based program that's offered locally. Take them birding, take them on a nature hike. There's lots of ways that you can introduce other people to the power that I'm sure many of you feel when you're out in nature, right? Use that as a portal to inspire others to take action and also feel that reduction in stress and anxiety. We all need that. We need to take the breather and have that experience and bring someone with you and expose them to the power that nature provides. So to come full circle, I started off with my story about the piping plover, and the reason I did that is not just to share a personal journey, but also it is an incredible conservation success story. So here in Massachusetts, piping plovers population, Atlantic population, relies heavily on piping plovers that are produced on the coast of Massachusetts. So Massachusetts produces about 50% of the Atlantic population of piping plovers. So let that soak in, right? We are a baby piping plover machine. Some of you may like that more or less than others, but Massachusetts is incredibly important for the entire population of these birds. So 30 years ago, I walked that beach and I got yelled at and people threw beer cans and Coke cans at me. Sure, that still happens today, I have no doubt, but in way less amount. So the majority of people love these birds. How could you not? Look at that little puffball, they're adorable. So, you know, that 30 years ago, we really focused on this shift of how we share the beach with these birds, and that shift has happened. Is it 100%? No, of course. I don't live through rosy-colored glasses. But we have dramatically shifted the way that beachgoers experience the beach and the culture of sharing the beach with the birds. So we've moved the dial on that cultural acceptance of sharing the beach with the birds and reducing some of the actions that we do from April 1 until September. And it has had a huge impact on piping plovers. So this is a gigantic conservation success, but with that comes a whole lot of responsibility too. We can celebrate all that we want around how important Massachusetts is for piping plovers, but it also means we have a whole lot of responsibility in making sure that there continues to be baby piping plovers being cranked out of the beaches along the coast of Massachusetts. So let birds be our guiding post. Let birds be our source of inspiration. Birds are doing all that they can for themselves to keep them around. They're given all they can to give us joy and to have us go out there and spend all that time watching those birds, right? It's now our turn. It's our turn to stand up, our turn to be the voice for these birds so that they continue to be here for next generations to love and be inspired by. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott and Amy. They've graciously agreed to stay for some questions and answers before our reception. And Annie, would you come up here and I'll walk the microphone around? We'll go from there. Okay. Thanks. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Hi. With all the climate change going on, what species do you see as the canary in the coal mines, so to speak, with everything going on?
Well, I could be flippant and say all of them, but I won't do that.
Well, no, just what you
But-
see as the first ones
Right.
that are really in danger with everything going on.
One of the species that I've been working with for a number of years is a snowy owl. And I'm sure most of you know Norman Smith from Mass Audubon, who's been working since 1981 at Logan Airport. Norman is part of Project Snowstorm, which is something that about 30 of us started 12 years ago when we had that amazing snowy owl eruption the winter of 2013, 2014. And I just should, sorry. Tell you what, I'm going to do this. How about that? That's much better. No, I can't do that. I'll hold it and I'll hand it to you. Okay. We'll make this as complicated as we can. So snowy owls.
It's on.
Okay, so snowy owls breed at the very highest latitudes in the northern hemisphere, all around the circumpolar region. Canada, Alaska, Russia, Scandinavia. They can't go any farther north than they already are. And they only breed successfully in years when there are high rodent populations, where about every 4 years on average the lemming population booms and crashes and booms and crashes and booms and crashes. And the booms happen when there's a thick, deep, insulating layer of snow on the ground, because down at ground level it's nice and toasty warm, and the lemmings can start having babies in the middle of the winter and kind of jumpstart this population boom. And come springtime, when the snow starts to melt, there's lemmings everywhere. And the snowy owls barely have to exert themselves to produce lots of babies and lots of food for their babies. What's happening with climate change is that the winters are becoming wetter and warmer. So instead of having thick, deep, fluffy snow, you've got shallower, wet, ice-crusted snow. And in several places in the world, places like Arctic Scandinavia, where those lemming populations have been booming and booming, booming and busting like a metronome for like 100 years, and then they just kind of flatlined. The lemmings are still there, but they don't produce those huge peaks, and so the snowy owls have stopped nesting in those areas. In other places, like parts of the Russian Far East and Wrangel Island, they still peak, but instead of peaking every 4 years, it's more like every 6 years or every 8 years, so they're not breeding as often. However, the good news is that climate change is weird, and in the central and eastern Canadian Arctic, late winter and early spring have actually gotten colder and snowier, and so conditions for lemmings are better there. So the snowy owls we're getting here on the New England coast are coming down from that part of the Arctic. So it's kind of a mixed bag, but I would say snowy owls are certainly near the top. And my colleagues of mine with Project Snowstorm and our colleagues around the world in the International Snowy Owl Working Group just published a paper in December. It was the first global conservation status assessment for snowy owls. And we found that, first of all, there are far fewer of them than we thought because they've been overestimated for years. Only about, instead of 300,000 or so worldwide, it's more like 14,000 to 28,000 individual snowy owls. And the population has been declining for about the last 3 snowy owl generations. So, yeah, that's the one that I worry about the most. On the other hand, there are birds that have been adapting to climate change, because I don't want to leave us on a really sour note here. Many of our short distance migrants, birds that like, eastern bluebirds and phoebes and brown thrashers and American robins that winter within the United States or northern Canada, those birds are responding to the earlier seasons. They're returning to from their nesting grounds earlier. And we're seeing even with some of our neotropical migrants that come all the way up from Mesoamerica, wood thrushes that are arriving weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks earlier than they did 50 years ago, trying to keep up with that galloping change in the season. So we underestimate the resiliency of birds at our peril. Nature is resilient, birds are resilient. We just have to make sure that we give them half a chance. That was a very long answer, sorry. Other questions?
Hi, would you talk a little bit about the administration's plans for changing the Endangered Species Act, if you've not already addressed that, and what Mass Audubon's doing and what we can do?
Okay, well, so I'll address what the administration is doing. The administration has proposed changing its interpretation of the Endangered Species Act to redefine the word harm. It would seem pretty basic. We understand what harm is. Under the new interpretation, anything that they do to the environment, to the habitat, would not constitute harm. Harm would only be directly killing the animal or killing the plant. So as long as you don't shoot an endangered ocelot in South Texas, if you bulldoze the Tamaulipan thorn scrub forest on which it depends, that would not constitute harm under the Endangered Species Act. The only way we can protect endangered species is by protecting their habitat. So, I mean, that's the gist of what they want to do to the ESA. They're doing the same thing to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, which is the foundational law under which we protect our migratory birds. When BP had that horrible, the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010 in the Gulf of Mexico, BP was fined billions of dollars, including hundreds of millions of dollars under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, because that oil spill killed enormous numbers of birds. The first Trump administration changed the interpretation, changed the way in which they would apply the Migratory Bird Act to say, unless a company intentionally killed a bird, in other words, just got up in the morning and said, I'm going to go kill me some gannets in the Gulf of Mexico, that would not count under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. The Biden administration changed it back to the original and I think correct interpretation. The Trump administration has flipped that once again. And we're seeing that across the board with the Clean Water Act. The Supreme Court has gutted the aspects of the Clean Water Act. It's gutted significant aspects of wetland protection in this country, and there's another case coming before the court that could do even more damage. All of us, it's all about raising voices, and all of us need to be voices for the environment. Can I ask you to talk about what Mass Audubon's doing in terms of advocacy, or is that too far? Okay.
Yeah, thanks. So I mean, Mass Audubon has an advocacy and policy part of our organization, and we are revving that up. I think, one thing that we are very much focusing on is the fact that, there's a lot of power within the state level, and for Massachusetts, we're very both fortunate, but similar to the piping plovers, right? We're fortunate and also have a lot of responsibility to be even stronger voices at a state level. So, there are multiple fights here, and so it's about standing up and being vocal and working at a local and state and obviously federal level. So our policy team is, working hard every day. We've launched, Some of you may be involved in our Nature and Climate Champions program, which is a grassroots, volunteer-driven advocacy program. We have an Advocacy 101 training course, multi-series course that we're giving people the tools to have in their toolkit to have their voices heard and to maneuver through how we have, have an impact.
Yeah, the one thing I would add is all of us have a voice and all of us need to use it. And right now, there is so much coming out of the administration at so many levels, so much bad stuff happening across the board, not just in the environment, but in terms of election rights and civil rights and voting and immigration. And so even if you have an elected representative that has a reputation for being really good on the environment, don't assume that they're paying attention to all this other stuff. Because my impression, frankly, is a lot of the environmental stuff is registering almost under the radar with a lot of folks in Washington who are thinking in terms of what from their perspective is bigger picture stuff. And I think it's important to let your congressperson know, let your senator know that all of this is important, and the stuff that's happening on the environmental side it deserves an equal amount of their attention and their protest and their action as whether we're deporting 4-year-olds with stage 4 cancer who are U.S. citizens. I mean, there's a lot of important stuff happening at once, and we've got to make sure that the environmental stuff does not get lost in the shuffle.
A little bit on the lighter side. I'm just kind of curious, how do you band a hummingbird? And do they really make bands that small?
They actually do, and actually I make them myself.
Oh, that answers the question.
So hummingbirds have little tiny legs. You just use little tiny bands with little tiny pliers, and I'm not being flip about this. The bands are so small that it's 5,600 to the ounce. They're these teensy tiny little things. You put them on with a specialized pair of pliers to make a little round circle, little bracelet on the bird's leg, and off it goes. And most of the hummingbird banding I do now is focusing on vagrant western species of hummingbirds like Rufus and Allen's and Anna's and calliope hummingbirds that are evolving a new migratory route and a new wintering area in response in part to climate change, because instead of flying south into the mountains of Mexico for the winter, now they're going to Baton Rouge and Tallahassee. And it's not a bad place if you're a hummingbird, and it's a little bit shorter than flying all the way to Oaxaca when you only weigh 2.6 grams, less than a nickel. But yeah, it's just teensy stuff.
Instead, oh, there it goes. Okay. And your list of things.
Right up to your,
on
put it
the
right up to your
list
mouth.
of things that, thank you, that you listed, Amy, I was interested in having one or both of you talk about the Dark Skies program, which is something I really believe in. We've seen huge results locally in getting public parking lots to shut off their lights at a certain time every night, getting neighbors to eliminate those tree lights from the ground up. Could you educate all of us a little bit more about it, please?
Sure. Artificial light at night is the term for it, and it's astoundingly disruptive to nature in general, not just birds. But lights at night and lighted buildings at night are particularly dangerous for birds because they get confused and they fly into them. We lose a lot of birds every year from causes that should be relatively simple to correct. 1 to 2 billion birds a year that fly into windows. As Amy said, there's great ways that you can retrofit your windows, simple things. They're not terribly, they're a little bit disruptive looking through the window, but little tiny UV reflective decals that you can put on them. Turning off your lights at night. It's better for the environment. It's better for you. Sleeping in the dark is better than having a nightlight on. And it doesn't interfere with the circadian rhythms of the animals around you. But particularly during spring and fall migration, particularly in urban areas where birds get confused and dazed and fly into lighted buildings. We lose between 1 to 2 billion birds a year just from building collisions during migration. And those are, along with cats, Amy mentioned cats, 2 to 4 billion birds a year in the United States killed by free-running house cats, pets, and feral cats both. That ought to be a simple fix, but unfortunately it's not. Cats have become a really polarizing issue. And it's a shame because cats are actually the single leading cause of human-related bird death in the United States. If you have a cat and you let it outside, it kills birds. I don't care whether you see them. I don't care whether you think your cat doesn't. Your cat's catching birds, because that's just the way cats are programmed. It's not the cat's fault. So there's all these simple things we can do. Turning off lights. How many coffee drinkers do we have here? Okay. How many of you drink shade-grown coffee? Okay. So those of you who don't, if you're interested in bird conservation, hundreds of species of our migratory birds that migrate to Mesoamerica, to Mexico and northern Central America, as well as the islands of the Caribbean, use traditional shade coffee plantations either as important stopover habitat on their flight south or as their primary wintering habitat. Shade coffee plantations are the way we grew coffee for more than 200 years in Mesoamerica, where a small family farmer, goes into an existing, intact, functioning, biodiverse forest and plants a few widely scattered coffee shrubs where the coffee ripens slowly and develops all these complexities of aroma and flavor, and then they pick them, and the birds do well, the farmer and his family does well. The inexpensive coffee that you buy in the grocery store, however, is where a large multinational has gone in and bulldozed the whole forest and planted rows and rows of sun-tolerant coffee that is now then soaked in fertilizer and insecticide and fungicide, and for cheap coffee, except there's no such thing as cheap coffee. That is now, what had been a forest is now the ecological equivalent of a parking lot, and the birds have paid the price. So I would charge you, if you are a coffee drinker and interested in birds, look for coffee with the bird-friendly certification seal from the Smithsonian Migratory Bird Center at the National Zoo in Washington. It is the gold standard of certification programs. There are other certification programs out there. Some of them are not worth their weight in coffee beans. We won't get into which ones they are. One has a little green tree frog, is all I'll say. But the Smithsonian bird-friendly coffee, Amy and I have seen this traveling to the highlands of northern Nicaragua, where there's a town called San Juan del Rio Coco, where 400 family farmers in that area are part of the local co-op. In order to qualify for bird-friendly, all their coffee must be USDA organic certified, and it's all of these 400 farms are bird-friendly certified. The premium price they get for that coffee is allowing them to buy up and revegetate former grain fields, cattle pastures, what had been degraded habitat, and turn it back into bird habitat. They're growing new bird habitat in the highlands of Nicaragua because of the bird-friendly coffee program. So, and it's also really good coffee. I'm not a coffee drinker, but my job is to bring the coffee to my wife in bed every morning because she is the coffee drinker. Why am I doing? No, they're gonna think I'm a good husband, and that fools them.
Why don't we have one or two more questions before our reception? But Art, go ahead.
Thank you, Scott and Amy. This has been a very interesting learning experience. Thank you. Okay, thank you. There's an axiom. It's collaboration is how the difficult things get done with engaged team members. Given the army of bird watchers that we've identified as 96 million, how do you think it would be possible to create a collaborative of all bird watching entities growing in itself to have power that's needed to respect what's got to happen?
Well, of course, getting 96 million people to pull in one direction is never going to happen. But you're right. I mean, 37% of the American public ought to be an irrefutable voting bloc. I think the unfortunate reality is most of those 96 million Americans have a lot of different degrees of interest in birds, and most of them are not single issue voters, or they are. If they are, their single issue is something other than birds. But you're right. Even a significant fraction of 96 million people ought to be enough to make any politician stand up and pay attention. And so I think what we're seeing, because of the appalling damage that's being done so quickly right now, there is a recognition across the country, across disparate nonprofits, many of which perhaps, just because this is the nature of fundraising, may have been in competition with each other, realizing that you know, we must stand together or we're all going to fall. That this is a unite or die moment for those of us in the conservation field. And I think we're starting to see, I hope that we're starting to see people regaining their footing here, because I mean, we've just been, I don't know about you, but I have just felt bludgeoned for the last couple of months. You just, every time you turn around, it's another gut punch. But I think we're finding our feet. I think the country is starting to find its voice. And I think that the environment has to be one of those important issues that we push, because at the end of the day, nothing else matters if we don't have a functioning planet. And so, do I have a roadmap for how to get all 96 million people on the same page? No, but I think there's a recognition across the nonprofit spectrum, across the conservation spectrum, that this is the moment for us all to come together. This is the moment for us to start speaking as one voice. This is the moment for us to take to the streets for the environment as well as for all the other things that we need to. And frankly, I speaking personally here, I think the only thing that is going to really alter the trajectory is more and more of us out in public, on the streets, raising our voices, making it very clear that we are not going to put up with this.
Just to add, while we line up the next question, while we do that, you know, a lot of nonprofit leaders, definitely across New England, but across the country, are constantly in communication and working together and sharing resources, right? You know, legal resources, all of those pieces. So it isn't quite answering your question as far as a roadmap, but that, like, to bring executive teams and CEOs and presidents and directors together to work and learn from each other in this time, and to hold each other up is happening for sure.
I would just hope that the Audubon could be one of those leaders to make that happen.
Yeah. Yes.
Hi, yes, I wonder if you could speak about the red knots and the horseshoe crab farming and how that's going currently.
Okay, so red knots are one of these long-distance migrant shorebirds. They're about the size of a robin. They winter, the eastern subspecies, it's Calidris canutus rufus. They winter at the southern tip of South America, and they make this extraordinary migration. They kind of hop from Tierra del Fuego up to the coast of Brazil, stop, gain a lot of weight like the bar-tailed godwits, and then they make this nonstop migration to the Delaware Bay between New Jersey and Delaware. And they arrive in mid to late May when horseshoe crabs are spawning. And not to pat myself on the back here, but I was the first journalist back in the 1990s to write about the looming danger for the red knot, which was these crabs would come up on the beach by the hundreds of thousands and dig their nests in the sand, and they lay these little tapioca bead-size eggs that are full of fat, that are the perfect food for a bird that has to go from the Delaware Bay all the way up to the high Canadian Arctic to nest. But it was at a time when commercial fishermen were starting to catch large numbers of horseshoe crabs. You can't eat a horseshoe crab, but what you can do is you can chop it up in pieces and you can use it for bait to catch eel or to catch conch to sell overseas in the Asian market. And they were basically strip mining horseshoe crabs out of the Delaware Bay at such numbers that the number of crabs on the beach crashed and the number of red knots crashed, to the extent that they're now listed as a federally threatened species. Their numbers, I was fortunate enough to see the red knot population when it was still 100,000 versus the roughly 12,000 that it is today, when the beaches at places like Reed's Beach north of Cape May would just be blanketed with birds. Well, there have been attempts to curb the horseshoe crab fishing. There was a moratorium for a long time. There are restrictions on it. There have been efforts recently to lift those restrictions. I have a feeling those efforts are going to pay off pretty soon. The other thing that's been happening is that anybody here who has ever had an injectable drug or an implantable medical device owes your medical health to horseshoe crabs, because the copper-based blood of horseshoe crabs, there's something in there called limulase, which is an enzyme that reacts in the presence of gram-negative bacteria. It's the only way it was for many years the only way to test for the presence of deadly gram-negative bacteria. Well, people to this day continue to harvest horseshoe crabs and bleed them alive. They don't kill them exactly, but they take about a third or half of their blood for this. There is now a synthetic material. There's a synthetic limulase that makes it no longer necessary to harvest horseshoe crabs, suck their blood like New Day vampires, and return them weakened to the Delaware Bay. And only just recently was the last step in federal approval for this synthetic version of limulase put in place. So hope there for horseshoe crabs, hope there for red knots, but there's a long way to go. I mean, compared to where we were just 30 years ago in terms of population, it's been really tough. I suspect we need to head downstairs.
I was just going to say that.
So, thank you all.
We could keep going for a while here, folks, but the Weidensauls have been here all day with us, and so there is a reception downstairs. Sue Little of Jabberwocky is going to be selling some of Scott's books. We welcome you downstairs, but right now, let's give a big hand for Amy and Scott Weidensaul.